What's going on, guys? It's John DeYong here, and welcome to part 2 of my 3-part series on how to find an A-grade market, an A-grade area, or an A-grade property. Today, I'm going to be focusing on an A-grade area and how to identify areas that have potential for future capital growth. If you haven't watched part 1 already on how to find an A-grade market, go ahead and watch that one first, as it goes into some critical detail about the different market cycles. I'll leave it down in the description section below. As a quick refresher though, that video doesn't address a market as it's commonly referred to as the whole Australian property market, or even state-specific housing markets. It addresses an A-grade market in the form of the thousands of sub-markets scattered throughout Australia. Because there are thousands of sub-markets, they can be very area-specific. So some of the topics and concepts discussed in that video can still be applied when looking for an A-grade area. I won't go into too much detail, but these include population growth, high incomes, and stock on market. Essentially, we're looking for an increase in demand and a shrink in supply. For this video in particular, as a very high level overview, there's going to be 4 main elements that we will discuss that I look at when analysing an area. These are going to include livability, commutability, current trends, and potential future impacts. The first two, livability and commutability, feed into something that we call gentrification, which is the process where a working class area is re-established by middle class landlords, developers, and home buyers. This brings higher income earners into that neighbourhood, and in turn brings more wealth into that area. This comes in many different forms, but a good example would be through small businesses, such as a local cafe. First up, let's talk about commutability, which is basically just the distance that we have to travel for everyday life activities. We've only got 24 hours in our days, 66% of which we're either working or sleeping, and we don't want to spend the rest of that 34% traveling between these everyday activities. These everyday activities change depending on what stage of life you're in, but generally include work, education, and the city. If you're loving this content, make sure you smash that like button, as it seriously helps out with the YouTube algorithm. Walking is predominantly the most efficient way of commuting. Being less than a 15-minute walk to drop the kids off at school, or at least walking distance to public transport, is hugely beneficial, instead of having to jump into your car, drive to the local train station, and then commute into work. Being able to catch public transport into work removes the requirement of having to constantly refuel your car, paying for toll roads, and even maybe paying for parking. Look into the census data of that specific area to understand how many people in that area actually take public transport to work, before just presuming that being the closest to a train station is going to be your holy grail. Being on top of a train station isn't particularly ideal either. Public transport, of course, isn't for everyone, and for those people who have the luxury to drive into work should have access to those main distributors. And this all ties back into being in that middle circle of the CBD. Somewhere between 5 and 15 kilometers is generally considered acceptable. It's all well and good to have access to these commutable areas, but without it being livable, no one would even want to walk the streets anyway. So let's go into some details about how to find a livable area. Firstly, I would look for areas with a higher ratio of owner-occupiers compared to investors. Generally, somewhere around 70% of owner-occupiers is quite good. This is because owner-occupiers take pride in their homes. They generally look after their property cosmetically and keep them well maintained. Secondly, if something was to happen all of a sudden to the property market, such as interest rates skyrocketing back up or negative gearing policies being approved, it might cause some of those investors to reactively sell their property. And if you had bought a property in an area that had a higher ratio of investors and they're all irrationally selling their property, it would cause more supply to be on the market, and it would bring down the value of your property. No one likes busy roads, in particular main roads that you generally get stuck in traffic on. These roads are really noisy, and even when you think they're going to be quiet at night, there's generally a hoon or two causing a ruckus. So when looking in an area, look for the quieter streets that have access to these main roads. As I was talking before about gentrification and small businesses popping up, it's handy to be walking distance to the local shops so that you can run down to the bakery on a Sunday morning and get a loaf of bread to cook breakfast. And even if you're not in the mood for cooking, being walking distance to a local cafe. Everyone is in a different stage of life, so these small businesses should also include restaurants and stores. Alongside that, being close to amenities such as parks for the kids or walking and riding tracks all aid in the resourcefulness of our free time, and therefore increase the livability of that area. The final point for livability is the community in general. At a very micro level, this starts with our neighbours. We all want good friendly neighbours who would check our mail and take our bins out if we're away. At a macro level, this extends from a barista at the local cafe to the patrol on neighbourhood watch. If I was driving through a new area where there was a shutter on every second house and a locked gate on every other, it doesn't feel very inviting and it hinders that community feel. Current trends are also good indicators to gauge the state of an area. These tie in quite closely to finding an A-grade market, but are well worth mentioning here too. At the forefront, I would look for a good historical capital growth over the last 10 years. Property cycles generally span over several years, and by taking a 10-year or more approach, you're going to account for all of the ups and downs of a property cycle. I would look for areas with good historical capital growth growing at a higher rate than the region average over a 10-year period. In saying that though, I would also analyse the trends of the last 2 or 3 years and ensure there hasn't been a surcharge in price growth. Any area that's grown more than 30 or 40% over just a couple of years is generally overpriced and it may be due for a price correction. Unless of course it's grown at that rate historically over the last 10 years. Time on market is also a good indicator to find out how quickly properties are being sold. With a decrease in time on market, it means that there's more demand and properties are being snapped up at either their first auction, sold prior to auction, or early on in the private sale process. An auction campaign generally runs for 4 to 5 weeks, so I use 30 days as that benchmark for time on market. Although, if I was looking at one particular property that's been on the market for 60 to 90 days, it's easy to presume that everyone else just thinks that's a bad property and not to buy it. Sometimes this is the case, and if you do your due diligence, you'll be able to figure out why. Other times though, this could just simply mean that the owners overpriced their property for the current market conditions, and after a couple of price reductions, it could be well worth considering. This ties into vendor discounting, which is how much a vendor is willing to discount their property by to get the sale done. If you look at time on market and vendor discounting together on a graph, they're completely counter-cyclical. Whereas time on market decreases, vendor discounting increases. Although we have already talked about higher incomes increasing the value of an area, population age ties this all together. I look for areas where younger professionals are living, generally between the ages of 25 and 35, because they have their whole career of wage growth ahead of them. Peter Kalousos, the property professor, recently did a study of early age indicators of gentrification in Adelaide, and specifically relating to that age group of 25 to 35, he found that a decrease in the people aged 18 years and under, and a decrease in the population of people without children significantly increased the early age indicators of gentrification. I would check recent vacancy rates. You want good, strong rental demand, so that when you go to rent out your property, you're not having to pay your mortgage down for months without having any rental income. A good benchmark for this is 30 days on market before being leased. Although we don't have a crystal ball and can't predict the future, there are some things that may impact an area both good and bad in the very near future. I would completely avoid areas that are heavily industry reliant, such as mining towns or temporary working areas. These areas may go up in value drastically in a short amount of time, but you have to time the market perfectly to make your money. I would look out for government spending in the area. This generally provides services to the people in that area and should increase the demand for the area once spending is complete. I want to know what other things you guys look out for when scoping out a potential investment area. Leave it down in the comment section below. This video doesn't cover off every single little thing that you should do. Always talk to the locals and understand that every area comes with its own due diligence. There might be a sewage pipe running through half of the street, or a rough patch that you should avoid buying in. These are things that only the locals would know. On the flip side of that though, don't fall into analysis paralysis and be overwhelmed with all of the checks that I've talked about here. There may only be a handful of suburbs that tick all 100% of these checkboxes, so just understand that some of these checks are more valuable than others. As always, seek your own professional financial, legal and property investment advice. These videos are just my opinion and should never be considered as personal advice. If you're keen for more content like this, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification button so you don't miss a video. And until next time, happy house hunting.